Historic Lake Champlain divides New York State and Vermont for much of its 120-mile length from the Canadian border south. This video will look at northern Lake Champlain, from the Crown Point Bridge to the Canadian border, its shorelines, islands, important landscapes, ecosystems, geology, and history. A companion video explores southern Lake Champlain below Crown Point. Lake Champlain is bordered on the west side by the 6 million acre Adirondack Park, by the ecologically important Champlain Hills, and one large city, Plattsburgh, New York. On the east or Vermont side, the lake is bordered by extensive farmland leading east to the Green Mountains and one large city, Burlington, Vermont. Lake Champlain is drained northward by the 106-mile-long Richelieu River into the St. Lawrence River, downstream and east of Montreal. Outlet waters from the 32-mile-long Lake George drain into Lake Champlain. In the last 500 million years, the Champlain Valley has been covered by a warm, shallow sea, a mile-high ice sheet, a large glacial lake, and an arm of the Atlantic Ocean seen here. We begin at Coote Hill, an important place for birdwatchers to observe annual bird migrations. Coote Hill overlooks Bulwaga Bay near Crown Point. Bulwaga Bay is known for hundreds of sightings of the elusive champagne lake monster called Champ, and is the southern end of the wider Lake Champlain north. On its south shore, the bay has a large silver maple swamp. Approaching Crown Point Bridge, we see the fort built by the French in 1730, but captured and rebuilt by the British in 1759. The Green Mountain Boys captured the fort in 1775 and transported 29 cannons to Boston for the defense of Boston Harbor during the War of Independence from Britain. The bridge spans the Narrows, dividing Lake Champlain north from Lake Champlain south. Farmland dominates the Vermont landscape between the lake and the Green Mountains to the east, interspersed with forest. This farm and forest mix continues to the Canadian border. Entering Button Bay, we see more farmland bordering a broad sand beach and two limestone islands with a limestone point. As we progress north on the lake, you will notice many shorelines and islands are of sedimentary rock, usually limestone, dolostone, or sometimes quartzite. The Champlain Hills on the west side of the lake have remarkable biodiversity. They are the richest forest and ledge communities in northern New York, with the most ecologically specialized species and more rare plants than any other Adirondack plant community. This Champlain Hills plant community has over 170 ecologically specialized species that do not occur in ordinary northern forests, and at least 70 species that are largely or completely restricted to this community. Many of these rare species are at their northern range limit, drought-tolerant, and require limey soils. 8 rare species here are the shrubs leatherwood and fragrant sumac, plants purple clematis, field chickweed, limber honeysuckle, Bicknell's geranium, Allegheny vine, and Douglas's knotweed. Offshore of Split Rock, the lake is about 700 feet deep to bedrock, but some 300 feet of that depth has filled in with sediment. Headed north, we see farmland on New York's shore, with more Champlain Hills beyond Willsboro Bay in the distance. The Bokeh River has the steepest drop of any river flowing out of the Adirondacks into Lake Champlain, and has brought much sand to the river's outlet. The river's mouth is now a park and conserved lands, thanks to Peter Payne, Jr., the man who shepherded the Adirondack Park's land use plan into law in 1973, nearly 50 years ago. Peter is the owner of Flat Rock Camp, used by many over the years for meetings shaping conservation in the Adirondacks. Visualize this Willsboro Bay landscape, 20,000 years ago under ice a mile deep, and after warming some 13,000 years ago, when the ice retreated, the area was depressed from the weight of the ice, allowing marine waters to flow into the St. Lawrence estuary and flood much of the Champlain area with seawater, creating an arm of the Atlantic Ocean called the Champlain Sea. About 10,000 years ago, the land gradually rebounded and cut off the supply of salt water and slowly became freshwater Lake Champlain again. Marine fossils and beluga whale bones can be found here, especially on or near Isle La Motte. Schuyler Island has a rare occurrence of Stony Point shale, which is more common in Vermont. The pressures of tectonic plates colliding 450 million years ago provided the pressures and heat to cause mineralogical changes of limestone layers into marble and shale into slate. Marble and slate are in evidence around Lake Champlain, but common in Vermont where they are still mined. The Ausable River has 2 active outlets and 1 partially active channel flowing into Lake Champlain through a sandy delta. The Ausable drains much of the high peaks, including slopes of Mount Marcy, New York's highest mountain. Within the sand delta, the river has changed course frequently, and former cutoff channels and meanders are seen, bordered by young tree lines. A closer look at the delta shows examples of the river's meanders within the sand delta, creating a complex of old channels, backwater sloughs, old tree lines, new channels, and new tree lines. Valcour Island was the site of an important moment in American history. A naval battle of Valcour Island took place here on October 11, 1776. The main action took place in Valcour Bay, a narrow strait between the New York mainland and the island. On the 11th, after 2 days of sailing south in search of Benedict Arnold's smaller American fleet, the British ships passed along the eastern shore of Valcour Island, while Arnold had positioned his ships in a line on the western side between the island and New York shore. Baited by 2 American warships sent out to attract them, the British gunboats and warships rounded the southern tip of the island and sailed upwind within range of the main American line. Struggling against a stiff headwind, the British fleet was successful in positioning most of its ships in a line of battle against Arnold just after noon. Both fleets exchanged heavy volleys of cannon fire, with several ships on both sides taking serious damage. Arnold's Revenge was heavily hit, and the Philadelphia was damaged and eventually sank later that afternoon. As darkness fell, the British called off the attack and the American fleet retreated. On the moonless, foggy night, Arnold's damaged fleet threaded its way through a gap between the New York shoreline and the line of British ships, and by morning they had slipped away. Most of the ships remaining in the American fleet under Arnold's command were captured or destroyed by the faster British force the next day further south toward Crown Point. Arnold knew control of the northern lake was now firmly in British hands, and he ordered the destruction of the fort at Crown Point before retreating further south to Fort Ticonderoga. Despite losing 11 ships and nearly 200 sailors to capture or casualty, the American defense of Lake Champlain stalled British plans to reach the upper Hudson River Valley. Switching from history to geology, trilobites are found here on Crab Island in a layer of Montreal limestone visible on the shoreline. Cumberland Head was home to a distinctive lighthouse built in 1838 and first lit in 1868 using a 4th-generation Fresnel lens. Cumberland Head hosts one of 4 ferries crossing Lake Champlain in summer and is the only ferry operating between New York and Vermont in winter. The channel is kept open and free of ice by operating the ferries 24 hours a day during the coldest winter months. The shoreline on Cumberland Head is limestone-like argillite, except for the beach at Cumberland State Park, which is sand. Woodruff Pond fills a portion of the wetland behind the state park at the peninsula's base. Treadwell Bay to the north is surrounded with beaches of limestone and hummocks of argillite. Ponta Rouge State Park has hiking trails well marked for plant and tree communities and is an outdoor classroom that provides information about common Lake Champlain plant and tree communities. In the 19th century, the historic Ile La Motte was home to large quarries producing limestone for Radio City Music Hall, the National Gallery of Art, the Vermont State House, and piers for the New York-Brooklyn Bridge. This limestone was produced from the Chazy Fossil Reef Formation, the world's oldest reef in which fossil corals first appeared, formed some 500 million years ago. This reef is also visible on Valcour Island. Marble on Ile La Motte is actually a bluish to gray crystalline limestone and is locally called fossil marble. Continuing north toward the Canadian border, we see active and productive farmlands on New York's side of the lake, just south of the Great Chazy River. This farmland is typical for the band of farmland that wraps around the north end of the Adirondack Park and follows the St. Lawrence River west to Lake Ontario. Approaching the northern end of Lake Champlain, we cross Kings Bay and the Kings Bay Wildlife Area, largely a silver maple swamp. Looking north beyond the village of Rouse's Point, we see a bridge crossing the arm of the lake to Vermont, and just beyond the bridge, under the arrow, we see what looks to be a treed island, but is actually long-abandoned Fort Montgomery. A fort with 30-foot high stone walls was started here on narrow land north of Rouse's Point in 1816 to protect Lake Champlain from the British, but was halted in the next year when surveyors discovered the fort was actually in Canada. Thereafter, the fort was known as Fort Blunder. A treaty moved the Canadian border north of the fort in 1842, and after construction was finished, the fort was rechristened Fort Montgomery in 1848, but never used. Having reached the Canadian border, we now fly south on the Vermont side of Lake Champlain to see its three major river deltas. The Missisquoi River has the largest river delta on Lake Champlain at 7,000 acres and is a national treasure peatland. The river has 4 active outlets and several partial or former outlets. This large delta is a national wildlife refuge and designated a wetland of international importance. It is a species-rich peatland where its fens and bogs hold a rich diversity of plant life. There are 17 state uncommon species here and 45 state rare, threatened, or endangered plant and animal species. Vermont's largest heron rookery is here on the north side of the delta at Shad Island. Endangered black terns nest here on the refuge, as do Vermont's ospreys and eagles. The delta is on the Atlantic Flyway and is visited by 20,000 or more ducks seasonally, some of whom nest here in spring. Leaving the Missisquoi headed south, we see islands in the lake, almost all of whom have rocky shores. We fly over several examples. We pass St. Albans on the way south. Flying over the Lamoille River outlet into Lake Champlain, we see the most recent large delta formed by the river over the last 20,000 years. When the mile-thick glacial ice receded north of Burlington about 13,500 years ago, the water level here was about 500 feet above the land, with the weight of glacial water slowing the land's rebound. But when the ice sheet retreated far enough north for the trapped glacial lake to escape down the St. Lawrence Valley, the water level immediately dropped and the land started slowly rebounding, free of the weight of glacial ice or water. Over time, the Lamoille River brought a great quantity of sediment from the former glacial lake bottom into Lake Champlain, creating lower deltas in the lake, leaving older deltas as higher terraces behind. This geologic history affected the Missisquoi and Winooski rivers similarly. The Lamoille Delta has some lovely landscape elements few have seen, like these two aerial close-ups. Colchester Bog, often flooded in April and May, sits between developed shorelines at the base of Causeway Park and is part of the Winooski River Delta. Causeway Park is the beginning of an unusual bike trail on a former railroad causeway that connects to Grand Isle with a small gap for boats. The gap has 2 small docks and a bike ferry to bridge the gap. Yes, a bike ferry. Add the bike trail to your list.